Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the first comprehensive reports. His reaction, according to aides present, was initially one of stunned silence. He had spent decades studying naval warfare, preparing for every conceivable contingency. But this was something new, something that defied military logic as he understood it. The cultural context made comprehension even more difficult. Western military doctrine valued the preservation of trained fighting men. The Japanese military, however, had long been influenced by the Bushido code of the samurai, which emphasized death before dishonor. This fundamental difference in military philosophy created a psychological barrier that American commanders struggled to overcome. By November 1944, intelligence reports painted a chilling picture. The Japanese had established formal kamikaze training bases. They were developing specialized aircraft for suicide missions. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was strategy. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, expressed the growing concern in a memo to Nimitz. "We have successfully adapted to every change in enemy tactics thus far. But the kamikaze represents something different. It cannot be countered simply by improving our gunnery or changing our formations." The Navy's first tactical adaptation was the establishment of radar picket lines around the main fleet. Destroyers were positioned 50 to 100 miles from the main body, serving as early warning platforms. It was a dangerous assignment. These ships would be the first to encounter incoming kamikazes, often with limited support. The psychological toll on American sailors was immense. Unlike conventional combat, where skill could improve survival chances, kamikaze attacks introduced an element of randomness that haunted even the most experienced veterans. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the first comprehensive reports. His reaction, according to aides present, was initially one of stunned silence. He had spent decades studying naval warfare, preparing for every conceivable contingency. But this was something new, something that defied military logic as he understood it. To understand the American reaction, we must first understand the cultural context. Western military doctrine, developed over centuries, valued the preservation of trained fighting men. A pilot who survived 25 missions was more valuable than one who died in his first. The Japanese military, however, had long been influenced by the Bushido code of the samurai, which emphasized death before dishonor. This cultural foundation made the concept of suicide attacks more acceptable to Japanese military leadership than to their American counterparts. In the days following Leyte Gulf, U.S. Navy intelligence scrambled to make sense of these attacks. Initial assessments varied wildly. Some analysts dismissed it as a desperate, disorganized tactic that would quickly fizzle out. Others recognized it as a coordinated strategy, but believed it would have limited effectiveness. Few, if any, initially grasped the full scale of what was coming. Meanwhile, in Japan, the kamikaze program was expanding rapidly. What began as an ad hoc solution in the Philippines was being institutionalized. The Japanese military was allocating resources specifically for suicide attacks. Specialized units were being formed. Aircraft were being modified to better serve as guided missiles. Pilots were being trained specifically for one-way missions. By November 1944, American sailors began noticing changes in Japanese attack patterns. The enemy seemed more determined, more reckless. Anti-aircraft gunners reported planes that flew through barrages that would have turned back any conventional attack. Ships' lookouts noticed aircraft approaching at unusually low altitudes, making them harder to detect until the last moments. On November 30, 1944, the USS Franklin, an Essex-class carrier, was struck by a kamikaze. The aircraft crashed through the flight deck, and its bomb exploded below, killing 56 men and wounding 60. The damage was severe, but not fatal to the ship. What concerned naval commanders most was the effectiveness of a single aircraft in causing such casualties. In Pearl Harbor, a special meeting was convened. Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Spruance, and other senior officers gathered to discuss this new threat. Minutes from the meeting, declassified decades later, reveal the depth of their confusion. The enemy appears to have abandoned conventional air tactics. Read one entry. They are employing aircraft as guided missiles. This presents a fundamental challenge to our defensive doctrine. The Americans faced a psychological barrier as much as a tactical one. How do you defend against an enemy who doesn't value his own survival? How do you apply conventional military logic to an opponent who has rejected its basic premises? These questions kept naval planners awake at night. The kamikaze threat escalated dramatically in early 1945 as American forces approached the Japanese home islands. On January 7, 1945, the USS Nevada was hit by a kamikaze off Luzon. The attack killed 11 men and wounded 49. But more troubling to naval commanders was the realization that these attacks were becoming more frequent, more coordinated, and more effective. Intelligence reports began painting a chilling picture. The Japanese had established formal kamikaze training bases. They were developing specialized aircraft for suicide missions. They were reserving their most experienced pilots, not for conventional attacks, but to lead formations of less experienced pilots on one-way missions. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was strategy. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, expressed the growing concern in a memo to Nimitz in February 1945. We have successfully adapted to every change in enemy tactics thus far. But the kamikaze represents something different. It cannot be countered simply by improving our gunnery or changing our formations. We must fundamentally reconsider our approach to fleet defense. The first tactical adaptation was the establishment of radar picket lines around the main fleet. Destroyers were positioned 5,100 miles from the main body, serving as early warning platforms. It was a dangerous assignment. These ships would be the first to encounter incoming kamikazes, often with limited support. The USS Lafay earned its nickname, the ship that would not die, on April 16, 1945, when it survived an onslaught of 22 Japanese aircraft, including 6 kamikazes, in just 80 minutes. Despite 4 direct hits, the destroyers shot down 9 planes, though 32 crew members were killed and 71 wounded. The Navy responded by expanding combat air patrols, maintaining constant fighter coverage to intercept incoming aircraft. This stretched resources to their limits, creating a battle of endurance as much as tactics. Kamikazes proved particularly effective due to their approach profile, flying low, often below radar, then popping up at the last moment to dive on targets. This made detection and interception extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda romanticized these pilots as modern samurai, making the ultimate sacrifice. Letters from kamikaze pilots emphasized honor and duty, though intelligence reports revealed complex motivations ranging from genuine belief to social pressure. The Battle of Okinawa saw the largest concentration of kamikaze attacks, with approximately 900 missions launched against Allied forces. The results were devastating. 26 ships sunk, 168 damaged, and nearly 5,000 American sailors killed. On May 11, 1945, the carrier USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes in quick succession. The first crashed through the flight deck, its bomb exploding in the hangar deck. 30 seconds later, a second plane hit, causing further devastation. In total, 396 men were killed and 2,000 were wounded. The ship survived, but was so heavily damaged it never returned to combat. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched the Bunker Hill burn. He had commanded carrier task forces throughout the war, witnessing some of the most intense naval combat in history. But the kamikaze attacks affected him differently. "We are fighting an enemy who has made a religion of death," he wrote in a letter to his wife. "How does one defeat such an enemy without becoming something like them?" The psychological toll on American sailors was immense. Unlike conventional combat, where skill and training could improve one's chances of survival, kamikaze attacks introduced an element of randomness. A ship could be doing everything right, maintaining proper watch, executing correct evasive maneuvers, putting up effective anti-aircraft fire, and still be struck by a determined pilot willing to die to achieve his objective. Navy chaplains reported increased requests for counseling and spiritual guidance. Sailors who had faced torpedoes, conventional bombs, and naval gunfire with stoic resolve found themselves shaken by the face-to-face nature of kamikaze attacks. Many reported trouble sleeping, haunted by images of pilots locked in their final moments, eyes visible through cockpit canopies as they dove toward their ships. The threat evolved as the Japanese developed more specialized suicide weapons. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, or Baka bomb, as the Americans called it, was essentially a human-guided rocket. Carried to the target area by a bomber mothership, it would be released to glide toward its target, then ignite its rocket engines for a high-speed final approach. With speeds exceeding 600 mm in its terminal dive, it was nearly impossible to shoot down once launched. On April 12, 1945, the destroyer USS Manert El Abele became the first ship sunk by an Oka attack. The weapon struck the ship amidships, breaking it in two. The entire action, from release to impact, took less than 60 seconds. The ship sank in minutes, taking 84 crew members with her. Back in Pearl Harbor and Washington, naval planners wrestled with the implications of these weapons. They had developed countermeasures for almost every Japanese weapon. But the suicide attacks presented a unique challenge. How do you defend against a weapon that is, by definition, successful if it simply hits its target, regardless of the survival of the delivery system? Tactical adaptations continued to evolve. Ships began sailing in tighter formations, with overlapping fields of fire. Destroyers were assigned specific sectors to protect. New radar systems were rushed into service to improve early warning. The Navy even experimented with barrage balloons and other obstacles to make low-altitude approaches more difficult. What the Americans didn't fully appreciate at the time was the internal debate within Japanese military leadership about the kamikaze program. Some senior officers, including Fleet Admiral Osamu Nagano, initially opposed the tactic as wasteful of trained pilots and contrary to the Bushido Code, which emphasized skilled combat rather than mere sacrifice. Others, like Vice Admiral Onishi, argued that Japan's situation required extreme measures. Even Emperor Hirohito reportedly expressed reservations about the kamikaze tactics when first informed of them. According to accounts from imperial household officials, he questioned whether such tactics were in accordance with the spirit of the Bushido. But as the war situation deteriorated, even these reservations faded. The kamikaze program became not just a military tactic, but a symbol of Japan's determination to resist invasion at any cost. By mid-1945, American intelligence had pieced together the full scope of the kamikaze program. Estimates suggested the Japanese had reserved over 10,000 aircraft for special attack operations. They had trained thousands of pilots. They had developed specialized weapons and tactics. This wasn't a temporary aberration. It was a fundamental component of Japan's defense strategy. The implications for the planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, were staggering. Naval planners projected that kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet could cause casualties on an unprecedented scale. Some estimates suggested as many as 400,000 Allied casualties in the first 30 days of the invasion, with kamikaze attacks accounting for a significant portion. History would ultimately take a different course. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, followed by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, forced Japan's surrender before Operation Downfall could be launched. The kamikaze program, which had been intended to deter an invasion, became part of the broader narrative of Japan's desperate final months. In the aftermath of the war, American naval officers had the opportunity to speak with their Japanese counterparts about the kamikaze program. What they discovered was both enlightening and humbling. The Japanese had developed the kamikaze tactics not out of a death wish, but out of a calculated assessment of their strategic situation. Faced with overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority, they had sought a technological and psychological equalizer. Admiral Nimitz, who had initially struggled to comprehend the kamikaze tactic, later wrote, "While we could not understand or condone the method, we came to respect the determination that drove it. The kamikaze represented a response to desperation that we, with our abundant resources, could never fully appreciate." The legacy of the kamikaze attacks continues to influence naval doctrine to this day. Modern fleet defense arrangements, with their emphasis on layered defenses and early interception, trace their lineage to the lessons learned in the Pacific War. The concept of asymmetric warfare, where a weaker opponent seeks unconventional means to attack a stronger one, finds one of its most dramatic expressions in the kamikaze program. In Japan, the memory of the kamikaze pilots remains complex. Some view them as heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Others see them as victims of a militaristic government that manipulated young men into throwing away their lives. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. What did the U.S. Navy think when they first took kamikaze tactics? They thought, initially, that it was a bizarre aberration, a desperate act that would quickly fade away. They were wrong. They thought it was inefficient and wasteful. It was, but it was also effective. They thought it was irrational. It was, but it was also strategically coherent from the Japanese perspective. Most importantly, they thought they were fighting a conventional war against a conventional enemy. The kamikaze attacks forced them to realize they were fighting something different, a war not just of weapons and tactics, but of philosophies and values. It was a lesson that would resonate long after the last kamikaze dove into the sea. The story of the U.S. Navy's reaction to kamikaze tactics is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder that military planning must account not just for what opponents can do, but for what they might be willing to do. It's a testament to the adaptability of the U.S. Navy in the face of an unprecedented threat. And it's a window into a moment when two military cultures, each operating from fundamentally different assumptions, clashed in the most dramatic way imaginable. As we look back across more than 7 decades, the kamikaze attacks remain one of the most haunting and controversial aspects of World War II. They challenge our understanding of military ethics, strategic logic, and the limits of human endurance. For the U.S. Navy officers who first encountered them, they represented a moment when the familiar rules of war suddenly changed, forcing a rapid and sometimes painful reassessment of everything they thought they knew about their enemy and about the nature of conflict itself. The names of those killed by kamikaze attacks are etched on memorials and preserved in naval archives. Behind each name is a story of service and sacrifice, of a life cut short by an enemy who turned his own death into a weapon. To remember them is to remember the true cost of war, paid in human lives, regardless of the tactics employed. Today, as former enemies meet as friends and allies, the kamikaze attacks serve as a powerful reminder of how quickly the world can change, and how yesterday's unthinkable can become today's history. The U.S. Navy's initial confusion, followed by adaptation, and ultimately respect for the determination behind the tactic, reflects a broader journey from conflict to reconciliation. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Navy's encounter with kamikaze tactics is the simplest: that in war, we must always be prepared for the unexpected, for the enemy who refuses to fight by our rules, for the tactic that challenges our fundamental assumptions. In that moment of first contact, when the Japanese plane emerged from the clouds and flew relentlessly toward the American ship, something changed in naval warfare. The world would never be quite the same again. If you found this examination of military history and human psychology compelling, consider sharing it with others who seek to understand the complex realities behind the simplified narratives of war.